When an organization like Fort Wayne's Quest Club sets out to celebrate its 100th anniversary as a place where members learn and share what they've learned, it's only natural to wonder, how did we get here? It turns out there is no better question to ask about Quest Club or about Fort Wayne, because Fort Wayne's history from the earliest times has been all about getting here and going places. That's what Quest Club members have been doing for the past 100 years. And here's the big story of transportation and Quest Club's 100 years. At first, people here walked or used the rivers. Rivers to the east flowed north to join the Great Lakes waterway at Lake Erie. Those to the west ran south to join the Mississippi. The magic is in how a short portage from the St. Mary's to the Mississippi, by way of the Wabash, joined the two great waterways across the barely perceptible backbone here of a mini-continental divide. Miami Chief Little Turtle called this place
that glorious gate through which all the good words of our chiefs had to pass from the north to the south and from the east to the west.
The first Europeans who came here saw the value in this place at the juncture of the rivers too. In his 1868 history of Fort Wayne, Wallace A. Bryce wrote about
the missionary, trader, and explorer in their devious windings and ambitious zeal for the redemption of savage souls on the one hand, and to become suddenly wealthy and famous by the accumulation of large quantities of fur on the other hand.
And the new American president understood how important this magical place was to his fledgling nation's future. Quester Mac Parker.
George Washington recognized from his reading of history that where a mountain range separated an area, that the territory on the other side of the mountain was likely to end up as a wholly separate country. And with the British already in Canada and the French with trading posts throughout the Midwest, he recognized it was very important to get American settlers in.
Fort Wayne was the wild, wild west then, with trading posts and saloons raggedly lining muddy trails. But its days as a frontier town were limited. In 1794 came the fledgling U.S. Army's hard-won victory over the Native Americans, who had protected this place so fiercely and well, and soon real settlers arrived and laid out the first plats of a city.
Well, my family came to Fort Wayne back in 1835. That was a very early period when the canal had just begun to be built, but they arrived on a flatboat on the Maumee River. George Freeman Hill and his wife Abra and their cousins, Asa, Charles, and Oliver Fairfield. And the Fairfields brought to Fort Wayne the very first carriage at that time. And they arrived in town, and it was still very much a small frontier community, hardly built up, mostly log or wood frame houses.
Ah, the canal, a grand vision dug by hand through thick forests and vast wetlands. Bob Copper explored Fort Wayne as a historic transportation hub in a 1977 Quest paper.
By 1834, some 1,000 men were working on the Wabash-Erie Canal. In fact, the labor force outnumbered the regular population and altered the life in this frontier area.
The land was swampy and malaria was rampant. Most of the workers were kept on the job by barrels of whiskey. The key person was a jigger boss who passed out shots of whiskey all day. Historians remind us that hundreds of people died building the canal. The canal changed Fort Wayne from the Wild West to a booming trading center for the surrounding agricultural areas, now that original forests were being cleared at a pace of thousands of acres a year. The canal was a wonderful boon to Fort Wayne, and even though it was financially doomed, immediately everyone knew the railroad was the obvious improvement, and Fort Wayne's founding fathers worked as hard to get the tracks laid into town as they had to get the canal dug and its locks and aqueducts built. The city's first locomotive, destined to support track-laying work, ironically arrived on a canal boat in 1852. The canal was abandoned in 1882, by which time the railroads reigned supreme. Fort Wayne continued to grow dramatically and added manufacture to its trading center economy. Clearly, the ways of getting here and going places have changed over the decades. Through the words of questers themselves, it's possible to trace the kinds of changes that transportation by rail, over pavement, and through the air have made on lifestyles and living conditions of those of us who live right here. By 1911, Fort Wayne was a city of 64,000, with 67 passenger trains a day coming and going, in addition to more than 100 freight trains. And it had a brand new club called Quest. Transportation was on their minds. Because the city had won the Pensy shops, where the post office is now, workers had good, important jobs keeping trains going, even though everyone talked about how the smoke was so thick in there that a man could hardly see. And it wasn't just the Pensy shops.
Jenny Electric was established here because of a need for lights and engines, and because cars were being built here. So too, George Westinghouse started here, testing his air brakes on rail cars. The Bass Foundry grew huge because of the activity. Kunkel Valve was started after E.O. Kunkel made significant safety valve discoveries while in the employ of the Pittsburgh shops. The skills learned in railcar building that made Fort Wayne a tool and die center also made possible the establishment of Bowser, Tokheim, and Wayne Pump. The rolling mills were established because of the existence of transportation and need for rails and sheet steel. Wayne knitting mills needed the transportation and the immigrants that railroad building brought here. The various wholesale companies were outgrowths of the early trading developed in Fort Wayne. And there is little question but what good transportation and workers with mechanical skills were material in the decision to locate International Harvester here.
The city fathers were still hard at work making sure more and more people and goods could get to and go out from Fort Wayne. Express trains like the Broadway Limited whisked Fort Wayne travelers to Chicago in just 2.5 hours, dramatically shortening the travel time from the canal era. The Wabash Cannonball rode through here too. Railroads ran excursions to special events and to the lakes. A popular one was operated on weekends from Fort Wayne to Rome City and Sylvan Lake. It was known as the Pond Lily Special. The fare, 50 cents round trip for adults, children free.
I've said that Fort Wayne might well have become the rail gateway to the West. However, a decision by the Nickel Plate to locate its shops at Stony Island, just outside Chicago, was a bitter blow to Fort Wayne promoters who had waged a fierce battle over a period of years to become the key city of that system.
It may have made everyone happier that around the same time Fort Wayne was building itself into a remarkable new transportation system that also used rails, just in a different way. From Alex Campbell's 1959 paper.
Indiana was the empire state of interurbans. Allen County was inseparably linked into the greatest interurban network in the country. At one time, it was reported that about 500 scheduled runs were made per day by Hoosier interurbans during the period of its popularity from 1910 to 1920. Allen County had 16 active lines whose names will be remembered with a degree of nostalgia. It seems only yesterday that the cars of those companies were seen ambling down our streets on their way to distant cities, the wheel flanges screaming and making short corner turns, and the sparks flying when the trolley pole was transmitting a difficult overhead pattern.
Those interurbans made a difference that questers, including Patty Martone, remember today.
I was born in 1930 in a Depression-era extended family where my young father was unemployed and unable to find work until 1932. At that particular time, he was hired at the Irene Byron Tuberculosis Sanitarium out on Lima Road. The only means of transportation he had was to go to Wells Street and take the interurban north to the sanitarium, where he boarded from Monday to Friday. Since we had no automobile, he boarded the electric car once again, came home on Friday night, And when he arrived at our Oakland Street duplex, I ran to my mother and said to her, "Mama, that man is here again."
Trains did all sorts of things for Fort Wayne. They brought us the top entertainers of the day who found it convenient to stop here on the way from New York to Chicago or wherever. Fort Wayne became an active center for theater, thanks in part to the railroads. Quester Tony McNair's 1998 paper notes,
Major New York agents formed syndicates through which they controlled shows and theaters, sending companies out on predetermined circuits. Fort Wayne did well because of its railroad connections.
The trains also carried our young men off to war and back home again, dead and alive. They kept us in touch with places far away, beyond the ties where our pioneer parents and grandparents had been able to maintain. Somewhat like the way the railroads overlapped the canal's best years, trucks and cars and buses appeared on our landscape, first as partners to the railroads, but they quickly proved themselves to be a new big thing.
In 1908, the Ford Model T was born into a world unequipped to handle the impact of its creation. Thousands, then millions of these cars were presented to a world only ready to handle horses and buggies. The creation of better roads and highways, filling stations and garages, hotels and overnight cabins, and an entirely new dealer network for automobiles followed. Ford had a clear and audacious vision. I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials, by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise. But it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own and enjoy with his family the blessings of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces.
The roads were a big deal, as Bob Copper reminded us back in 1977.
The Fort Wayne area was a center of trade even before the canal. It had a road system that was crudely made up. The roads were more by chance, and the only road improvements were the removal of trees and shrubs. Wagon trails would be the best description. Wet weather made some of them impassable.
Coupled with cheap gasoline, paved roads not only freed people to go wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, they contributed to the demise of passenger trains and interurban lines. While Fort Wayne was adding warehouse and distribution center to its list of economic strengths, Questers were on the trail on this pavement issue. Quality of pavement was a big issue nationwide. Fort Wayne's leadership in paving roads helped it win its spot on the route of the Lincoln Highway, America's first transcontinental highway. It's worth noting that bridges, which any city with 3 rivers requires in great numbers, also were important, and Fort Wayne's Lincoln Highway Bridge on Harrison Street was featured in the 1916 official Lincoln Highway Guide for both its beauty and how much it helped the traveling public. The pavement issue reached critical mass, so to speak, during Fort Wayne's post-war prosperity and growth. Fort Wayne's growing suburbs were creating even more demand for improved roads. Quester Les Gehrig laid out the challenge in his 1987 paper.
The automobile was minimizing the need to live close to one's work. The baby boom, coupled with a healthy local economy, was providing fuel for the unprecedented growth of new residential areas. In short, suburbanization had come to Fort Wayne. The majority of new subdivisions were, for the first time, being developed on inexpensive land located beyond the corporate limits of Fort Wayne. Suburban residents demanded better roads from the county government, yet the scattered locations of new subdivisions made meeting those demands both an inefficient and costly proposition.
The talk at Quest got pretty heated at times. Today we might call Quester J. Calvin Hill's 1967 paper a rant.
The providing and maintaining of traffic arteries is of great and vital necessity to the people of this community. And still we keep talking about doing something about our ability to move people and continually putting it off until it becomes critical. There was adequate knowledge of the requirement to build thoroughfares or throughways through this town, north and south, east and west, as far back as 1940. But the poor, misguided people of this community turned down, by referendum, the construction of such a project in 1947. And we're still talking about it 24 years later, and we are no closer to the solution of it than we were then. The prosperity and the growth of this community have been hampered and will continue to be hampered until it becomes an accomplished fact. Of course, we have a real glimmer of hope left in regards to the Thruway project, because we talked about the nickel plate elevation for at least 30 years.
Just like elevating the nickel plate tracks north of downtown opened up development of the city's north side, the opening of the US 30 bypass in 1952, I-69 in 1961, and I-469 in 1995 eased a lot of people's frustration, but apparently not Hill's.
Our other streets are becoming so clogged by allowing parking on them that on certain days it is virtually impossible for traffic to move. Because we have not the forcefulness nor the courage to face the fact that we won't spend the money to widen the streets or eliminate the parking. In our badly congested downtown areas, we will allow parking on our major thoroughfares even during rush hours only again to hamper the flow of traffic. And tell me why everyone in the community should pay to provide paved streets to be used for the few people who want to have free parking.
There must have been an amazing discussion after that paper. Meanwhile, Questers' lives were being changed and enriched while traveling over pavement. Bill Clark met someone he's never once forgotten.
I was a freshman college student and had returned home to Fort Wayne to spend the weekend with family. I had a trip to Fort Wayne, but not one back again to Bloomington, so I booked passage, as it were, on a Greyhound bus. And I went to the blue Art Deco Greyhound bus terminal that was then located on West Jefferson, took the first empty aisle seat next to a thin, unshaven man with sort of an ill-fitting sport coat, somewhat frayed at the edges, and his nicotine-stained fingers were clutching a banjo case. And he asked me if I knew who the fastest banjo player in the world was. I only knew of one banjo player, so I gave him the name of Eddie Peabody. And he looked at me for a moment and said, "Well, you're looking at the second fastest." And over the course of the next 2 hours, this rather naive and sheltered 17-year-old received a non-college curriculum type education on what life is really like on the road. I don't know his name, and long since the bus terminal on West Jefferson disappeared. But each time I drive by the current Fort Wayne bus terminal on Lafayette, I think back with a certain sense of nostalgia upon having shared that trip with the self-proclaimed second fastest banjo player in the world.
Otto Bonahum remembers his daily trip to high school via streetcar.
I lived on Brooklyn Avenue, and I had to walk up north on Brooklyn to Taylor Street, and I caught the streetcar. The streetcar went to the transfer corner, which was Main and Calhoun. And then you got off the streetcar and got on another streetcar that went south on Calhoun Street to Lewis and Calhoun, which is where I went to school at Central Catholic, so that we walked through the snow or whatever. The streetcars went through the snow, and we went through the snow.
Transfer Corner was a majestic sensory overload of tracks and overhead electric lines coming in all four directions, enabling streetcars to exchange passengers and most efficiently whisk them back out to the city. Quester Dave Lupke.
We would receive milk twice a week from Allen Dairy. The truck would arrive at about 7 in the morning on Mondays and Thursdays. A young man named Dave would come to our door, knock, open the door, call out, milkman, he'd walk in, and whether there was anyone in the kitchen or not, he'd walk in, go to the refrigerator, open it up, take an inventory. He would walk back to his truck, fill up his basket, return and stock our refrigerator with milk, butter, eggs, cottage cheese, whatever we needed. He was a huge blessing to a young family with 4 children, only one family car, and the residential milk delivery continued for over 20 years. When residential milk delivery finally ceased in Fort Wayne in the mid-'80s, my parents were one of the final customers, and a national dairy publication interviewed them to discuss the demise of the milkman in Fort Wayne and nationally.
Questers also have happy memories of early air transportation in Fort Wayne. Mac Parker tells the story of a bright light in Fort Wayne air transportation history.
My office in downtown Fort Wayne was in the Lincoln Tower for a number of years. And key transportation issue for me was always the searchlight or aircraft beacon on top of the tower. When the tower was built in 1929, delivering airmail across country was a very big issue. And the airmail pilots were romantic figures who flew in all types of weather and at night. And during the day, the route between Cleveland and Chicago, they used US 30 as their main guideline. But at night, the aircraft beacons were their guidelines across from Cleveland to Chicago.
Fort Wayne enjoyed the thrill of growing beyond the times when flight here was Art Smith and his aerobatics, and the only airport was what is now Smith Field. Fort Wayne International, named originally for World War I's first ace pilot, Paul Baer, who was from Fort Wayne, did not yet exist. Ben Eisbart told the story in a 1990 paper.
In December of 1938, the Aviation Commission reported, quote, "For the first time in the history of Fort Wayne, this city now has regularly scheduled night airplane transportation service, affording facilities for passenger, express, and airmail." During the past month, TWA, due largely to the fact that Fort Wayne has an airport so splendidly equipped, meeting the rigid requirements of the federal government and its new Civil Aeronautics Authority, included Fort Wayne on its night air route.
Bear Field was first a World War II Army Air Corps base, bringing 184 officers and 1,700 enlisted men to town. But the war ended, and the military didn't think it needed the base anymore, retaining control of only one small piece of the property.
By the end of the war, Bear Field had become a $10 million installation. The War Assets Administration put the field up for sale. On June 29, 1949, by actions of the City Council, the City of Fort Wayne took physical control over this 938-acre field.
At first, things were great. In 1950, Eisbart's paper reports, Fort Wayne was served by 3 major airlines, and Bear Field was the largest municipal airport in the state. A portion of Bear Field became an Air National Guard base in 1952. But Fort Wayne was in the grip of forces finally beyond its control when it came to air travel. Charlie Belch remembers the day airline deregulation took effect.
When you deregulated the airlines, many of the flights that would come to Fort Wayne, because they were required to come to Fort Wayne, no longer had to come here. And what was a full tarmac in the morning at Bear Field waiting to take off to various destinations dribbled down to a few planes.
Questers had more choices about how to get here and go places from here than ever before, and they took advantage of the enriching opportunities of travel, just like they took advantage of the enriching opportunity of being part of Quest Club. In its first 100 years, the club that began as a businessman's association has bloomed into a gathering of the intellectually curious, men and women, and Quest is known as a place where community leaders work on big ideas that have very often borne fruit for the city as a whole. Quest is stronger for this truth, and when we seek to learn together, we find common ground. Through it all, Questers have not only seen change, we've helped each other through changes, and we've changed ourselves and the city we call home.